Phronesis, so practical wisdom, is the Aristotelian idea that concerns itself most directly with how a man actually lives. Every time we have spoken about it on this channel, we have described phronesis in roughly the same way. We have described it as a trained perception or the developed capacity to see what a situation actually calls for. And that is right as far as it goes, but what we have left out until now is the deeper question of what that accuracy of perception actually depends on, because trained perception by itself does not really explain it. Take, for example, two men who have both lived for a long time and have both seen a great deal in their lives, and then you put them in front of the same situation. The first man, he reads the situation correctly and reacts correctly, while the second does not. But the second man isn't necessarily less experienced, or less attentive, or less intelligent than the first man. Both have been shaped by the same kind of experience over the same years, with the same close attention to the detail and to the world, and yet, when they look at the same situation, what each man sees is completely different. Now, think about it. If correct perception were only a simple matter of training, then this won't happen at all, because the same training would or should produce the same reading or the same reaction. But it does not. So the accuracy of perception is not really produced by experience alone. It depends on something else. It has more to do with the man himself who is doing the seeing than with the number of years he has put in or he has experienced. Now, Aristotle discusses phronesis in Book 6 of his Nicomachean Ethics, which is also where something fundamentally changes in how he approaches it. Because up to this point, he has been speaking mainly about the character-related virtues, so mainly about courage, generosity, temperance, and the rest of the virtues. He has been talking about the excellences that simply concerned with how we feel, how we act, and what we actually become through our habits. But in Book 6, he turns to another kind of excellence. He turns to the excellence of thought, so the intellectual virtues. And he lays out several of them. There is, for example, epistēmē, so scientific knowledge, which is knowledge of things that cannot be otherwise. Then there is Technē, so craft or art, which is the knowledge that is involved in making things. Then there is also Sophia, so theoretical wisdom, which Aristotle actually treats as the highest kind of wisdom. And then finally, there is also Phronesis. And what makes Phronesis distinct is the way Aristotle separates Phronesis from each of the other intellectual virtues. Start with epistēmē, for example. Epistēmē is scientific knowledge, and scientific knowledge, Aristotle says, is concerned with what is necessary. It concerns itself with what cannot really be otherwise. For example, the truths of mathematics, they don't just simply change when the situation changes. The angle of a triangle, it also doesn't change depending on who is looking at the triangle or under what kind of circumstances the triangle is actually being considered. But phronesis is not like that. Phronesis is concerned precisely with the things that can be otherwise. It deals with the variable, it deals with the particulars, it deals with a specific concrete situation, and it deals with the domains where the same thing may be right in one case and completely wrong in another. In other words, phronesis is concerned with everything that depends on particulars, and it is for that reason that it cannot really be a science, because there is no real fixed body of universal rules that, once you master them, can tell you how to act rightly in every single situation in life. Then there's Technē or craft, and this is a distinction we already made before in the video discussing praxis and poiesis. Technē essentially belongs to making. It is the kind of knowledge that is involved when a person tries to bring something into being. So things like making a table, building a house, writing a poem, building a ship, making a tool, or just simply some other physical finished object. The carpenter, for example, knows how to make a table because he understands the materials, he understands the form, and he also understands the sequence of actions that he has to take, and also the standards by which the finished object will actually count as successful. The carpenter's knowledge is not merely theoretical, it is actually applied and directed towards producing something. So the crucial point here is that in Technē, the end or the goal of the activity lies outside of the activity itself. The carpenter's sawing, measuring, joining, and smoothing the wood, these are all ordered towards something that is beyond those acts, which is the finished table or the finished chair. And once this object, the table, exists, then the activity has reached its end, and the thing made from the activity can stand apart from the maker and also apart from the process itself. That is why Aristotle treats craft or Technē as a knowledge of production rather than a knowledge of action. And this is also why Technē can be taught and systemized in a way that living well simply cannot. A craft can be broken down into procedures and also standards of completion. We can say, if we look at a table, a finished table, we can say in a fairly determined way whether that table has been made well or poorly made, because the end product is visible and it is separated from the process of making itself. But Phronesis is not like this. Phronesis does not belong to making. It belongs to acting, and the domain for Phronesis is praxis, not poiesis. And in action, the end is not a separate product that is left behind after the action has been completed. The end is actually internal to the action itself. For example, when someone acts courageously or justly, he is not really trying to produce an object that is called courage or justice that then stands apart from the act itself. The action is where the excellence appears. The doing is the thing or the aim that is being aimed at. And all of this is what makes practical wisdom fundamentally different from Technē or from craft. A craft aims at a result beyond the activity itself, while practical wisdom aims at acting well within the activity itself. In other words, Phronesis is not scientific knowledge because it concerns itself with things that change. It is also not craft because it is not aimed at producing any external object. And from this, we can actually reach one of Aristotle's most consequential conclusions, which is to say that there is no technique of living a good life. There is no technique of living well. There is no method we can simply acquire, and there is no system that we can simply master that will hand over the good life in the way that learning carpentry gives a man the capacity or the ability to make a table. Living is not making, and the wisdom that living requires is not merely a skill. All of this runs directly against the modern assumption that everything important can essentially be reduced to a simple procedure. Not really simple, but it can be reduced to a procedure. And that all expertise is ultimately under the hood just a technique that has been practiced to perfection. But Aristotle's point is almost the complete opposite here. In his mind, the most important form of human wisdom is precisely the one form of human wisdom that cannot be reduced to just some simple technique or procedure or system. So Phronesis is the intellectual virtue of action. It operates in the domain of change, and it is ordered towards the human good. But this raises another question immediately, which is, what actually determines the aim, and where does this human good that Phronesis points towards actually come from? And Aristotle's answer to this is that virtue makes the aim right, and Phronesis makes the things toward this aim right. And this aim, or the end, or the thing a man is ultimately striving towards, this is fixed by virtue and by the state of this man's character. Phronesis just works out how to get there. Phronesis looks at the particular situation at hand and sees what is actually required if that aim is to be reached. In other words, Phronesis doesn't really set the target. Character, our virtue sets the target. Phronesis just simply finds a way to get to the target. This is also why Aristotle connects Phronesis with deliberation. We do not deliberate in the deepest sense about whether the good is actually worth wanting, because it is worth wanting. Instead, we deliberate about the things toward this end. We deliberate about what this exact situation requires of us, what can actually be done here, which means are available to us here, which action actually fits this circumstance and how this end can be realized in this particular case. Deliberation does not create a goal from nothing. It doesn't create the aim. It just simply works within the direction that is already set by our character. But what exactly does it mean for our character to set the aim? Now, the easy version of this answer would picture this as a kind of conscious decision, as if the good man simply sat down one day and weighed his option in his mind and reasoned his way towards the right end. But that is not really what Aristotle has in mind. The end is not like something the good man merely concludes from logical reasoning. It is actually something he wants intuitively, because to the man whose character is properly formed, the right end appears as the thing that is worth pursuing, in the same way that good food appears desirable to a man whose appetite is sound. He doesn't need to argue himself into valuing it. He just values it because of who he is or what he has formed himself into. And that is why the aim belongs to virtue and not to simple, rational, cold-hearted calculations. Reason can only work out how to get there, while what is actually worth aiming at is settled in the part of us that is actually shaped by years of correct habituation. And here Aristotle posits that there is no phronesis without moral virtue, and no moral virtue in the full sense without phronesis, since each requires the other in order to become complete. Now, at first glance, or when you first read this, you'll think to yourself, well, this sounds a bit circular, doesn't it? And yes, it is circular. But Aristotle resolves this problem by making an important distinction between natural virtue and the virtue in an authoritative sense. The way he sees it, human beings are born with different tendencies. One man might naturally be bold from an early age. Another is generous by temperament before any serious moral formation has even taken place, while the third man is gentle by disposition. He is slow to anger without having to train himself into gentleness. These natural tendencies, they are real, and they exist before any judgment has been fully formed. A child can have them. Even a dog can have something that resembles them. But Aristotle says that this kind of natural virtue is not yet virtue in the full sense, because it lacks judgment. Natural boldness does not know when boldness is actually called for and when it becomes mere recklessness. It just pushes in this one direction that we are predispositioned towards. So the tendency that we're born with, it may be good, but it usually doesn't yet know its proper occasion or its proper balance. And the thing that turns this raw tendency into genuine virtue is phronesis. Practical wisdom will supply the judgment that our natural disposition lacks. It'll make boldness into courage by teaching it when to advance, when to stand firm, under what circumstances to stand firm and advance, and when not to act at all. Without this kind of judgment, boldness will remain a kind of uncalibrated forwardness that can be occasionally right, but if it is right, it is only by accident. But of course, this relationship doesn't just run in one direction only. Judgment needs the disposition, just as the disposition needs the judgment. Phronesis couldn't really make boldness into courage, right? If there was no boldness to turn into courage in the first place. The two have to be developed together. Our natural tendency will give judgment something to shape or something to mold, and judgment is what gives our natural tendency the discrimination. And across years and years of acting, choosing, failing, correcting, and attending to the consequences of our actions, our natural disposition and our natural judgment can then sharpen each other into one formed disposition or condition. So the circle is not vicious, it is developmental. Virtue in the full sense is the state in which natural disposition and practical judgment have become unified. And in this state, character will naturally want the right end, and judgment can then find a way to attain it. But there is, of course, also a flip side, because if virtue sets the aim, then no amount of practical intelligence or practical wisdom can actually rescue a man whose aim is completely wrong in the first place. Judgment can only work out the route towards the end. It cannot set the end. which means that if the character is pointed toward the wrong end, then greater skill, greater practical wisdom simply carries the man there more efficiently. This also means that there is another kind of capability that can look almost identical to practical wisdom. It can read situations, it can find means, and it can also execute effectively. But because it has no authority over the end it serves, Aristotle doesn't really call it wisdom. Instead, he calls this other wisdom cleverness. Now, Deinotēs, so cleverness, is the capacity to find the means to an end and to achieve it, whatever that end happens to be. And the qualification here matters because cleverness is completely indifferent to the end. It is pure capability. If you give a clever man a target, he will find a way to achieve it. He will see what has to be done. He will calculate the necessary steps. He will judge the timing and the situation, and he'll act. So, if the end itself is good, then this capacity is useful and also praiseworthy at the same time. But if the end is base, then the very same capacity becomes a readiness to do whatever is necessary in the service of something that should not really govern action at all. This is also why the clever man can be easily mistaken for the wise man. From the outside, he may look extraordinarily impressive. He will read people quickly. He'll see where a situation is heading before anything happens. He will notice opportunities, and he will know which kind of actions will get him to what he actually wants. His ability is real, yes. So the error is not really found in recognizing that he is clever or recognizing his intelligence. The error is found in treating this intelligence as though it already contains wisdom. What cleverness essentially shows is just a mastery of means. It doesn't yet show whether the end that is being pursued is actually worth being pursued. That is the decisive distinction here. A man, he may win negotiations. He may secure advantages. He may read every single room and person accurately, and he will still lack phronesis because the larger direction of his life is wrong. His defect is not that he cannot execute. He obviously can. His defect is that this execution serves an unworthy goal. And in this case, cleverness doesn't really fail. It succeeds, and that is exactly the danger here. Because cleverness will carry someone efficiently towards something that should never have governed them or governed their action in the first place. But phronesis is not opposed to cleverness. It includes the ability to find the means, to judge the correct timing, to read the particular situation, and to act well. The practically wise man is not less capable than the merely clever man. The difference, though, is that his capability is actually governed by the right end. In other words, phronesis is the power of means placed under the rule of a formed character or a formed disposition. That is the distinction Aristotle wants to make clear. There is a fundamental difference between the man who can get things done, who can get what he wants, and the man who has actually learned to want what is actually worth getting. Now, all of this brings us back to the problem we began with. Two men can have the exact same experience, they can have the same attentiveness, and they can even have the same intelligence, and they will still not see the same situation in the same way. One will read the situation correctly, while the other will not. So Aristotle's answer to this is that the difference is not simply in what they have seen, but in what kind of person has been formed through all of this seeing. Experience, in Aristotle's mind, doesn't just simply enter a neutral instrument, it enters a character, and character determines what this experience actually becomes. This is essentially what Aristotle means when he speaks of the eye of the soul. And Aristotle's claim here is that this eye, the metaphorical eye, does not reach its proper condition without virtue. It is not a merely neutral instrument that works the same way in every man and only needs experience to sharpen it or make it see. The way a man sees is shaped exactly by the kind of character he has, because phronesis doesn't merely register the visible facts of any given situation. It has to grasp what matters in those facts or in the exact situation. It has to see which features are decisive, what the situation is really calling for in action and what end should govern our response. That is why vice is so serious for Aristotle. Vice does not simply make a man choose badly after he has seen clearly. It actually corrupts the seeing itself. The bad begins to look good. The merely pleasant begins to look worth pursuing. The easier thing begins to look more reasonable than the better thing, and the smaller thing starts presenting itself as if it were the greater thing. In this condition, the man is not necessarily acting against what appears good to him. He is pursuing what appears good, but the appearance itself has, unfortunately, been distorted by the defective state of his character. In other words, the accuracy that is attributed to trained perception was always resting on character. The man whose character is sound, he'll see the end rightly, and precisely because he sees the end rightly, his reading of any particular situation will serve the right thing. He does not simply notice more details, he notices them under the right aspect. He can distinguish between what merely attracts attention and what actually matters. By contrast, the clever man, he may read the particulars with greater accuracy and still be wrong about one thing that ultimately matters, which is the end that those particulars are being used to serve. Phronesis is therefore not just simply a perceptive skill. It is the condition in which perception and character have become unified. The practically wise man sees rightly because he has been formed to want rightly. His judgment isn't just floating above his character as a separate faculty and correcting it from the outside. His judgment is actually the expression of a character that has learned what is worth aiming at and what is worth pursuing. That is what supports the perception. It is not just simply the experience or the abstract intelligence, but the formed character of the man who is actually doing the seeing. And this is why phronesis matters beyond any single decision. It is not merely the ability to handle situations well as they come. It is the wisdom by which a man's actions begin to form a coherent life. Without phronesis, even good impulses will remain scattered, and even intelligence can serve the wrong master. But with practical wisdom, character, perception, desire, deliberation, and action will begin to align and point in the same direction. So, ultimately, Aristotle's point is not that the practically wise man has somehow learned a better technique. It is actually that he has become the kind of man for whom the right thing appears as worth doing and who can then see what doing it actually requires of him.